The air in the room was thick, not just with the stale scent of $300 cigars and cheap floor sealant, but with the suffocating weight of history and unspoken territorial claims. This wasn't merely a business disagreement. It was a cosmic disturbance in the rigid, unspoken architecture of the American criminal underworld. For decades, perhaps since the very first shipments landed on the docks of New York, the rules had been immutable, carved into the stone foundation of organized crime. The pipeline belonged to the families, the profits flowed upwards, and the black market of Harlem operated strictly at the sufferance and under the financial supervision of those who traced their lineage back to the Sicilian mountain town. Frank Lucas, however, was a man who saw the established order not as a wall of unassailable granite, but as a flimsy partition built on outdated fears and logistical laziness. He had, with ruthless efficiency and a chilling lack of ceremony, committed the ultimate, unforgivable transgression. He had gone over the heads of the established powers. He had bypassed the Italian families, surgically severing the distribution artery they had so proudly controlled, bringing his product, the legendary ultra-pure blue magic, straight from Southeast Asia to the streets of New York, hidden inside the caskets of fallen American soldiers. It was an act of such audacious logistical genius and sheer disrespect that it bordered on mythological. And now, the bill for that disrespect had come due. The room was a back booth, velvet-lined and acoustically deadened, within a slightly faded, overly ornate Italian restaurant in Little Italy, a territory Lucas rarely dared to tread unless the stakes were this apocalyptic. Across the small, polished table sat Vincent Vinny the Serpent Giordano, a capo regime whose eyes seemed perpetually squinted against some unseen offensive light. Vinny was not merely muscle, he was the ledger-keeper of the old world, the embodiment of the tradition that Lucas sought to dismantle. Next to Vinny sat two men whose tailored suits did little to disguise the bulging, disciplined menace beneath them, their silence more eloquent than any threat. Vinny leaned forward, his heavy gold pinky ring catching the dim light. His voice, typically a low, gravelly rumble, was unnervingly measured, almost pedagogical. Frankie, the use of the familiar diminutive a subtle, insidious reminder of status. We've been patient. We watched you dance, and we let you keep the crumbs you swept up. We understood that every city needs its local color, its little hustler. But the crumbs, Frankie, they have become a goddamn mountain range. Lucas, in contrast, was a picture of contained, deceptive. Dressed in a muted, elegant wool suit, he looked less like a kingpin of heroin distribution and more like a prosperous middle-aged dentist. He sat back, his large hands resting lightly on the table, giving nothing away. He knew that any display of fear, any flicker of retreat, would be instantly fatal. He had walked into a den of wolves, and the only path out was to convince them he was, in fact, the alpha predator. The conflict wasn't about money anymore, although the hundreds of millions Lucas was pulling out of the market certainly stung the mob's quarterly reports. It was about principle, about the established chain of command. Lucas had not just started a rival operation, he had exposed the vulnerability of the reigning monarchs. He proved that the supposed golden pipeline of Marseille and the five families was inefficient, bloated, and overpriced. This fact, more than any pile of cash, demanded retribution. Vincent, Lucas responded, his voice deep, resonating slightly, maintaining a level of professionalism that Vinny clearly found insulting. I respect your history. I respect the effort you've put into maintaining certain logistical challenges over the years. But the consumer demands a better product, Vinny, and the consumer demands value. I merely filled a gap in the market. Vinny inhaled deeply on his cigar, the tip glowing crimson. He didn't laugh. He just performed a slow, deliberate exhale of smoke directly into Lucas's personal space. It was a purely juvenile, yet undeniably potent, gesture of dominance. A gap, Vinny repeated, his mouth twisting into a sneer that didn't quite reach his cold eyes. You call undermining the entire stability of the New York distribution network a gap. You call bringing military-grade smack into my city and running it without paying tribute a gap. You think this is the AMP, Frankie? You think we're talking about toothpaste margins? The tension in the air was palpable, vibrating the crystals on the antique chandelier above them. Lucas felt the sweat prickle the back of his neck, but he held his posture rigid. He was playing a game of chicken where the failure to hold the line meant literal extinction. Vinny's two associates shifted slightly, their hands casually near their waistline. This was the open loop that kept the curiosity active, the terror simmering. Everyone in the room knew what was supposed to happen next. Lucas was supposed to apologize, beg for a percentage cut. offer a massive tribute, and retreat back to his Harlem territory, tail tucked. He was supposed to accept the terms of surrender that Vinny was about to dictate, but Frank Lucas didn't know the word surrender. He had risen from the dirt of North Carolina, had seen too much violence, and built his empire on too much risk to simply hand it over because an old guard felt slighted. "Vinny," Lucas said, his tone shifting, shedding the thin veneer of corporate professionalism and adopting a hardness born of survival. "Let's be clear about what you're asking. You're not asking for respect. You're asking for me to surrender a superior product and a superior supply chain simply because you believe the color of your skin and your grandfather's birthplace entitle you to a monopoly that you haven't been able to defend. That sounds like bad business to me. It sounds like weakness." The words landed not like insults, but like meticulously placed hand grenades. In the mob world, an accusation of weakness was tantamount to a declaration of war. Vinny's face, usually a study in controlled contempt, tightened visibly, his jaw muscles locked. "You have a lot of courage, Frankie," Vinny murmured, the sound now dangerously flat. "Or maybe you're just stupid. We've tolerated the little empires in Harlem for a reason. They keep the noise down, they handle the street trash, and they know their place. You, Lucas, you forgot your place." He leaned closer again, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, though everyone in the small booth could hear every syllable. "We gave you a chance to come to the table and pay the street tax. We gave you time to realize that nobody sells product in New York without kissing the ring. You spit on the ring, Frankie." Vinny tapped the table rhythmically with the gold ring, a slow, deliberate drumbeat leading toward the inevitable crescendo of violence. He paused, allowing the weight of his implied threat to settle. Lucas's mind raced, not about an escape route, but about the precise moment of escalation. He had planned for this moment, not with a backup team. He knew the mob would sweep the area clean, but with a psychological defense. The moment of re-engagement arrived when Vinny suddenly stopped tapping. He sat back again, his eyes narrowing to mere slits. "Now, the offer has changed," Vinny stated, his voice now entirely devoid of warmth. "You cut your supply. You liquidate your current inventory under our supervision at a fraction of the cost as a penalty. You hand over the names of every person in your logistics chain, and you leave New York. You go back to North Carolina, and you never, ever come back. If you agree, maybe you live to see Thanksgiving. If you don't," Vinny trailed off, leaving the threat hanging, ripe and heavy like rotting fruit. The silence that followed was so profound, it felt like a vacuum pulling the air from Lucas's lungs. He knew this was the point of no return. Agreeing to the terms meant financial ruin and professional castration. Refusing meant a bullet in the brain bore the weight of the coffee. Lucas maintained his smile. It was not a genuine smile of amusement, but a controlled, almost surgical baring of teeth, a performance designed to confuse and unnerve his adversary. "Vinny," Lucas said, his voice soft, almost conversational, a stark contrast to the death sentence hanging over his. "I appreciate the history lesson, but history is full of dead empire. The world changes, and when it changes, the ones who stand still get run over." He lifted one of his large hands slightly, a tiny movement that drew Vinny's focus instantly. "I run a tighter ship. My product is better. My prices are fairer. You call me a hustler. I call myself a CEO. And I don't take orders from obsolete management." Vinny's face went dangerously slack, the color draining from his cheeks, leaving behind an unhealthy pallor. Lucas had crossed the final red line. He hadn't just refused the terms, he had ridiculed the very structure Vinny represented. The air cracked. Vinny Giordano moved with a speed that belied his age and girth. His hand flashed, disappearing momentarily under his expensive jacket, and reappearing holding a weapon that caught the dim restaurant light with a sickening gleam. It was a small, brutally efficient Smith & Wesson Model 10, the kind favored for close quarters work. The sudden, metallic intrusion broke the stillness. The silent bodyguards shifted, their focus now entirely on Lucas, ready to move the moment the shot was fired. The heavy, silver barrel was pointed directly at the center of Frank Lucas's chest, steady and unwavering. It wasn't pointed to scare, it was positioned to kill. The moment stretched into an agonizing eternity, the smell of gun oil mixed with the smoke and fear. Frank Lucas was staring death in the face, embodied by the cold steel of the revolver. Every fiber of his being screamed for fight or flight, yet he did neither. He simply held the gaze of the mobster across the table. And then, something extraordinary happened. As Vinny's finger tightened almost imperceptibly on the trigger, Frank Lucas's controlled, artificial smile slowly, genuinely widened. It became a look of profound, almost pitying certainty. the world stopped. The mobster had the gun, the power, the backup, and the absolute historical mandate to end this usurper. Yet the usurper was smiling back, utterly unafraid, supremely confident. It was a defiance that defied logic, a psychological weapon more potent than the steel pointed at his heart. Frank Lucas, staring down the barrel of a gun held by the most dangerous man in the room, didn't flinch. He didn't blink. He simply leaned forward, slightly, and opened his mouth. He knew exactly what he had to say to survive. It was the absolute truth, but it was a truth so devastating, so disruptive to the mob's carefully constructed reality, that it would force Vinnie Giordano to recalculate the cost of pulling that trigger, not just for his life, but for the life of his entire organization. The 5 words that would rewrite the criminal map of New York were hovering on his lips, ready to be deployed. He smiled into the face of death and prepared to speak the ultimate truth. The standoff froze, the gun immobile, the trigger half pulled. The next sound, the next action, would determine not only who lived or died in that back booth, but who truly controlled the streets of Harlem, and eventually the supply lines of the entire East Coast. The sheer magnitude of the moment hung suspended, waiting for the utterance that would either lead to a swift execution or an unprecedented, terrifying shift in power. To be continued in Part 2, where Frank Lucas reveals the crippling truth. The cold, dull gleam of the nickel-plated revolver was the only source of light that seemed to matter in the windowless back office of the club. It drew the eye, pulling focus from the rich, oppressive shadows that clung to the velvet wall coverings and the heavy mahogany desk. Rico's breathing was shallow, rapid, a sound like dry sandpaper being rubbed against wood, and the muscle twitching near his jaw was a metronome counting down to 0. The tension was not merely present, it was a physical weight pressing the air out of the room, forcing the 2 men into a silent, lethal ballet. Frank Lucas, however, did not flinch, did not sweat, did not even seem to register the immediate proximity of annihilation. His posture remained perfectly vertical in the antique leather chair, the silk tie precisely knotted, the expensive fabric of his suit jacket settling around him like an armor. It was his smile that truly disturbed Rico. It wasn't mocking, nor was it the desperate, thin grin of a man trying to bluff his way out of a dead-end street. It was a smile of pure, serene understanding, a predator's acknowledgement of the trap, combined with the absolute certainty that the trap was built with a fatal flaw only he understood. It was the smile of a man who knew he held the critical piece of leverage, even with a firearm pointed squarely between his eyes, a barrel so close he could smell the faint, acrid ghost of burnt powder lingering within its mechanism. "You find this amusing, Lucas?" Rico's voice was a guttural, strained whisper, betraying the seismic fury churning beneath his tailored exterior. He leaned in slightly, emphasizing the weight of the gun. "You, a street nigger, standing here and smiling at me after carving out the guts of my family's operation. The audacity, the pure, unadulterated disrespect is breathtaking. Breathtaking, I tell you." Rico didn't just mean the money, though the money was, undeniably, astronomical. What Lucas had done, sourcing directly from Southeast Asia, bypassing the entire French connection infrastructure, rendering the traditional routes across the Atlantic obsolete, was a historical act of economic terrorism against the 5 families. He hadn't just stolen customers, he had obliterated the entire supply chain paradigm they had relied upon for decades, a system built on rigid, brutal protocol and untouchable geographic exclusivity. Lucas had simply ignored the map, creating his own trade wind through the chaos of the Vietnam War. "Disrespect." Lucas's voice was low, measured, devoid of any tremor of fear. It cut through Rico's rage with the cold precision of a scalpel. "Respect is earned, Rico. It is not inherited alongside outdated business model. You want to talk about carving things out? Let's talk about the profit margins you were settling for. Let's talk about the garbage you were selling to the desperate and calling it product." Rico's finger tightened infinitesimally on the trigger guard. The sound was barely audible, a minute shift of metal on metal, but in the compressed atmosphere of the room, it roared. "Keep the names out of your mouth. You talk percentages. I talk graves. You disrupted the order. The order is sacred. You broke the rules that keep the peace, the rules that allow us to operate. You walked in and contaminated the well because you thought your little jungle pipe dream gave you a pass." "It wasn't a pipe dream," Lucas countered, his smile widening just enough to show a hint of teeth. "It was logistics. It was efficiency. While your men were waiting 6 months for a shipment of 20% pure garbage cut 7 ways before it hit the streets, I was running my own air force, bringing in 98% pure, uncut material. Blue magic. We called it that for a reason. It burns clean, Rico. It works faster, better, and costs me less than the bribe money your captains spend on Christmas gifts for the precinct chief. The casual, almost dismissive mention of his product's purity was a deliberate, staggering blow. Lucas was not simply defending his market share. He was exposing the inherent structural weakness of the established operation. He was making the Italian mobster confront the humiliating truth that their organization, vast and terrifying though it was, had become slow, fat, and incredibly inefficient. They were relying on history and intimidation, while Lucas was relying on modern, ruthless capitalism, optimized for maximum velocity and minimum overhead. You're talking business theory to a man with a gun, Rico spat out, his grip now white-knuckled. And you're talking ancient history to a man who controls 70% of Harlem's supply and half of Boston's by the end of this fiscal quarter, Lucas retorted, leaning forward slightly, demonstrating a complete lack of concern for the muzzle inches from his face. Kill me, Rico. Go ahead. The powder is already moving. My distribution channels are independent, built on loyalty, not fear. I bypassed the middlemen, bypassed the dock workers, bypassed your cousins who think throwing a guy in the river counts as sound fiscal planning. You kill me. You solve nothing. You create a power vacuum filled with 40 tons of blue magic and 30,000 furious customers demanding to know why their supply dried up. You think your crews can manage that kind of riot? You think they can handle the sheer volume? This was the core of Lucas's defensive strategy, not a plea for mercy, but a stark, terrifying presentation of the consequences. Killing Frank Lucas would not simply remove a competitor, it would unleash a localized, yet devastating, market crash, followed by a massive surge in law enforcement attention, focused on finding out who was dumb enough to disrupt such a lucrative operation. The established family's prized stability above all else. Lucas had become a chaos agent, and chaos agents, sometimes, were more valuable alive than dead, if only to contain the ensuing disorder. Rico's eyes narrowed, shifting from pure homicidal fury to a flicker of cold, calculating assessment. The air of absolute certainty in him had shifted, vibrating now with complex doubt. Lucas hadn't just brought a knife to a gunfight. He had brought a fully functioning parallel economics. You think you're untouchable because you found a cheap pipeline, Rico challenged, trying to regain the dominant position, his voice deepening to a harsh rumble. The pipeline can be cut. Your source, whoever they are, can be eliminated. We know how to apply pressure, Luke. We invented the word. You invented the word protection racket, Rico. I invented global sourcing. Lucas corrected him gently, almost paternally. And you're right, the source is everything. But you don't know the source. You don't know the mechanism. You have tried to find it. You've sent your best information brokers, your most tenacious goons, into the jungle, into the war zone. And what did they find? Nothing. Because they were looking for a traditional supplier. They were looking for a partnership. They were looking for another low-level drug lord. They weren't looking for an anomaly. Lucas paused, letting the silence expand and fill the room. The dramatic flourish was calculated, designed to make Rico sweat, to make the realization of his organizational blindness sink deep into his gut. The source isn't a simple transaction, Rico. It's embedded within the machinery of war itself. It is wrapped in the flag of American negligence. It's untouchable because it isn't in a warehouse in Marseille or a back alley in Sicily. It comes straight from the highest echelons of the US. Military, smuggled back on the same planes that carry the coffins of our dead hero. How many of your foot soldiers are willing to intercept a military cargo transport plane? How many of your enforcers want to start a war with the Pentagon? This was the true open loop, the pattern interrupt that shook Rico to his core. The realization that Lucas was operating on a completely different plane of existence, that his supply line was secured by the most powerful, yet most distracted organization on Earth, the US Armed Forces, bogged down in a costly, endless conflict. Lucas was utilizing military infrastructure designed for logistics and concealment, a logistical network that had been deemed impermeable by the very authorities who sought to control the flow of narcotics. Rico's hand trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the sudden, overwhelming magnitude of the information. He had suspected connections, rumors of the Asian theater, but the sheer brazen efficiency, using the very tragedy of war as a cover, was a masterstroke of evil genius he had never considered possible, even among his own ruthless peers. You lie, Rico whispered, the word hollow, lacking conviction. No one can bypass that much security. Not even the brass would allow that scale. They don't allow it. They facilitate it, Lucas corrected smoothly. A few corrupt sergeants, a few desperate pilots, a few contractors looking to make a quick retirement fund, and suddenly, the logistical nightmare of bringing the casualties home becomes the perfect camo. Think about it, nothing gets inspected with the same reverence as the personal effects of a dead soldier, or the cargo bays designated for military transport, especially when that transport is leaving a conflict. You think a customs agent in New Jersey is going to challenge an airman carrying a box labeled official military, or question why the caskets are slightly heavier than regulation. They salute the flag, they don't question the content. The room had gone completely silent again, the tension now transformed into a brittle, frozen anticipation. Rico had been reduced from an executioner to an appalled observer. He wasn't merely facing a criminal, he was facing a logistical philosopher who had weaponized bureaucracy and systemic corruption. Lucas had not just crossed the street, he had built his own parallel highway, paved with the moral decay of an entire nation at war. Rico slowly lowered the gun, though he did not fully holster it. The barrel drooped, pointing toward the floorboards, but his posture remained rigid, demanding an explanation, a path forward, a reason not to end Lucas right here and now, even if it meant risking the chaos. Lucas had to deliver the final psychological blow, the absolute confirmation of his necessary survival. So, you think this makes you bulletproof? Rico challenged, the rage morphing into a dangerous, grinding curiosity. You think because you figured out how to use the corpses of American boys to move your product, we can't find a way to deal with you? We can burn the whole jungle down, Luke. We can starve the street of your poison and force them back to our inferior product if we have to. You could, Lucas agreed, conceding the minor point with a slight inclination of his head. You could start a territory war that would paint the streets red, attract the federal heat you've spent 3 generations avoiding, and potentially compromise the few high-level political connections you have left, all to gain back 20% market share you lost because your product was weak and your organization was complacent. He paused, leaning back comfortably into the chair, the smile now settling into a look of intellectual triumph. He understood the mob mindset perfectly: profit over pride, stability over fleeting revenge. Or, Lucas continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial hush, forcing Rico to strain to hear the words that could determine the fate of both their empire. You could consider the alternative. You could admit that this business, this new reality, is too big for the old ways. You could admit that Frank Lucas is not a competitor you eliminate. He is a force multiplier you integrate. Rico stared at him, breathing heavily. The implication was clear. Partnership, not elimination. But partnering with Lucas meant accepting a black man, an outsider, into the sacred, segregated high council of the drug trade, an act of transgression almost as great as running the drugs themselves. It meant shattering the racial and territorial rigidity that defined the families. Integrate? Rico scoffed, the word tasting like bile. You think we'd allow that? You think you could sit at the table with us? Lucas's gaze hardened, removing the last vestiges of the charming businessman, replacing them with the cold, unyielding stare of the apex predator. This was the moment, the crucial, terrifying precipice, where negotiation ended and raw psychological leverage. He knew that Rico was struggling not just with the threat of chaos, but with the threat of irrelevance. Lucas held the keys to the future of the trade, and the Italians were clinging desperately to a dying past. He shifted slightly in the chair, his hands resting easily on his thighs, his composure absolute. He looked directly into the weary, conflicted eyes of the mobster who had just threatened his life, and allowed his perfect, calculated smile to return. He knew the 5 words he was about to utter were not merely a statement. They were a restructuring of the criminal universe, a declaration of a new, horrifying détente. Rico watched him, the fear now mixed with a desperate need for the clarity Lucas possessed. He raised the gun again, slightly, instinctively, demanding the answer that would end the suspense, whether in blood or in partnership. "Tell me now, Lucas," Rico demanded, his voice hoarse with effort. "Give me one reason, one single compelling reason, why you shouldn't be leaking on my carpet right now, and why my organization needs you more than it needs to crush you." Frank Lucas took a slow, deliberate breath, letting the magnitude of the moment settle on the oppressive silence. His eyes held the deep, unsettling confidence of a man who had already won. He parted his lips and began to speak the 5 words that would rewrite the rules of the game forever. the words that centered the entire New World Order on his own untouchable leverage, making him instantly more powerful than any man in that room or in that city. The chrome of the revolver seemed to drink the meager light filtering through the drawn blinds, a cold, polished crescent that dominated the universe contained within that small, opulent office, overlooking the chaotic artery of the city. The silence that followed the mobster's final, guttural snarl was not empty. It was pressurized, thick with the unspent energy of potential violence, the kind of silence that precedes an avalanche or the final, irreversible snap of a steel trap. Frank Lucas stood motionless, a study in tailored confidence, his expensive silk suit absorbing the humidity, his posture rigid but relaxed, a man confronting the end of the world with the mild interest one might reserve for a delayed train. Every instinct of the mobster, a man whose life had been dictated by the explosive, immediate reaction to disrespect, screamed at him to pull the trigger, to atomize this affront to tradition, to erase the audacity of this intruder who dared redefine the boundaries of their sovereign economic territory. The man holding the gun, whose face was a map of simmering, inherited fury, was vibrating with the need for validation. He needed Lucas to flinch, to beg, to offer a panicked concession, a desperate whispered offer of tribute that would reaffirm the eternal hierarchy, the old world masters and the new world supplicants. But Lucas did none of these things. He did not blink. He did not swallow. His eyes, dark, intelligent, and terrifyingly calm, remained locked onto the mobster's own, not on the muzzle of the weapon, but on the soul of the man wielding it. This was the second, more subtle hook, burrowing deeper than the immediate threat of lead and powder. Lucas wasn't facing a gun. He was facing a dying empire, and he knew exactly how much the man gripping the weapon feared obsolescence more than death itself. The context of this impending execution was simple and brutal: supply. For decades, the established families had enjoyed a monopolistic stranglehold on the heroin trade, reliant upon the slow, expensive, and increasingly scrutinized French connection, a Byzantine network stretching from Turkey to Marseille, then finally across the Atlantic. It was a system built on handshake deals, mutual respect among Italian families, and exorbitant overhead. Lucas, however, had bypassed the entire structure. He had found a back door, a hidden highway carved through the chaos of the Vietnam War, dealing directly with the original source, the vast, unforgiving expanses of the Golden Triangle, utilizing the most efficient, discreet supply chain imaginable, American military transport. His product, pure, cheap, and limitless, was flooding the streets, rendering the mob's established product laughable and their profit margins pathetic. This was the unforgivable crime. The conflict now coalesced around a single, agonizing moment of suspension. The mobster's knuckles were white against the steel of the grip. The hammer of the gun was already pulled back, its mechanism primed for catastrophic release. "Say your prayer," the mobster hissed, the words barely escaping his clenched teeth, tasting of whiskey and existential dread. "You think you're smart. You think you're untouchable. You come in here, wearing your clown suit, disrupting 40 years of order. You're nothing but a monkey with a briefcase, and you're about to find out what happens when you climb too high." The open loops remained taut. What knowledge did Lucas possess that allowed him such glacial composure? What leverage could possibly supersede the threat of immediate, definitive termination? It wasn't about money. Lucas was offering endless money. It wasn't about turf. He was offering to share, provided he remained independent. The leverage had to be absolute, a secret that, if revealed, would destroy the foundations of the man standing opposite him and, potentially, the entire commission. It had to be a revelation of failure, of systemic weakness so profound that execution would be pointless, serving only to confirm the mob's desperation. The development of the scene became a slow, excruciating dance of psychological warfare. Lucas offered a small, almost imperceptible smile. It was not mocking, but genuinely pitying, the smile of a predator watching a weaker animal attempt a futile bluff. He did not raise his hands. He did not retreat. Instead, he took a short, deliberate step closer, reducing the distance between his breastbone and the muzzle to mere inches. The mobster involuntarily recoiled, his confidence momentarily fractured by this blatant violation of expected human behavior. "I don't need a prayer," Lucas said, his voice a low, melodic rumble, utterly devoid of tremor. He spoke not like a criminal about to be executed, but like a CEO presenting quarterly results to a clearly failing board. "You're making a mistake, but not the one you think. You think this is about respect. It's not. This is about arithmetic. Your arithmetic is fundamentally flawed. The pattern interrupt was devastatingly simple. Lucas was changing the subject from life and death to supply chain management. You kill me, Lucas continued, allowing the words to hang in the air like poison gas. And you solve nothing. You create a short-term vacuum, mate, but the problem remains. The product remains. The price remains. You pull that trigger, and the $5 I charge for a bag becomes $2 tomorrow. And you know why? Because I built a system that doesn't need a middleman. It doesn't need a decade of negotiations in Sicily. It doesn't need your approval. The mobster's eyes flickered, the first sign of doubt. He understood the economics. He had watched their markets crater. He had seen the purity levels of Lucas's blue magic destroy their customer base. But acknowledging the source meant acknowledging their failure to protect their borders. You won't have a system if you're dead, the mobster spat, trying to reassert the primacy of brute force. We'll cut the head off your snake, and we'll take your contact. Lucas tilted his head slightly, a movement of profound dismissal. You think my system is based on me? You think I'm the secret ingredient? He let out a soft, dry laugh, the sound grating against the tense silence. You don't understand the military, do you? You still think the biggest power comes from men with guns? No, the biggest power comes from bureaucracy and logistics. I have the logistics, and my logistics are protected by men who wear the American flag, not men who wear cheap suits and whisper in Italian. The re-engagement point had been reached, the stakes elevated from a personal execution to a geopolitical statement. The mobster's hand began to tremble, not from fear of Lucas, but from the sudden, terrifying realization that he might be about to start a war with an enemy he couldn't see, an enemy entrenched within the very structure of the US government, the untouchable apparatus that Lucas had somehow managed to corrupt and utilize. Killing Lucas now wouldn't be eliminating a rival. It would be announcing to his unknown, powerful protectors that the old guard was too irrational and too violent to be reasoned with. The mobster desperately sought to regain control, needing Lucas to flinch, needing him to break, needing him to utter the final, meaningless concession that would allow the mobster to walk away with some shred of dignity, some belief that the old rules still applied. He pressed the gun forward until the muzzle touched the fine wool of Lucas's chest. "Tell me," he demanded, his voice cracking. "Tell me who you deal with. Tell me the name. Give me one name, and maybe I let you walk out of this room with your dignity, if not your profit." Frank Lucas's smile widened just slightly. It was the smile of absolute, unassailable confidence, the smile that knew the precise moment of victory. He leaned in, closer still, ignoring the cold pressure of the steel against his heart, meeting the mobster's furious, desperate gaze. He paused for an eternity, letting the gravity of the impending revelation settle, allowing the mobster to feel the full, crushing weight of his inevitable defeat. He then spoke the 5 words, softly, clearly, the words that would instantly dissolve the mobster's aggressive posture and forever change the dynamic of organized crime in America. The effect was instantaneous and physically jarring. The mobster didn't just flinch, he seemed to deflate. The phrase was economical, devastating, and entirely comprehensible within the criminal hierarchy. Lucas hadn't named a corrupt general, or a specific shipment date, or a single asset they could target. He had claimed the entire source. He was stating unequivocally that he had achieved such a level of vertical integration and control over the origin point of the product, the fabled Golden Triangle, the world's most lucrative and remote drug source, that attempting to cut him out was futile. To attack him was to attack the source itself, a source that was supplying the American military machine, and thus shielded by a vast, bureaucratic, and lethal invisibility cloak. The color drained from the mobster's face, replaced by a ghastly, sallow realization. The hand holding the revolver began to shake violently, not from rage, but from the paralysis of comprehensive defeat. Lucas wasn't just a businessman, he was a gatekeeper. He had built a supply line so streamlined, so direct, and so protected that the traditional families were not merely being undercut, they were being rendered obsolete. Killing him wouldn't stop the flow. It would only invite the chaos of a decentralized network to replace him, further driving down prices and exposing their desperate, slow-moving system. The loops closed with a sickening finality. The mystery of Lucas's untouchability wasn't about superior muscle or better bribes. It was about superior logistics and leverage over a supply chain that transcended the mob's outdated geographical limitations. The mobster, the representative of the old world, had the gun, but Lucas had the power. He had the product. The revolver wavered, then slowly, agonizingly, lowered. The steel scraped against the wool suit as the mobster's arm dropped to his side, the weapon now pointing harmlessly at the floor. The sound was deafening in the charged silence. The fight had left him, replaced by a look of sheer, defeated horror. He hadn't just lost a confrontation, he had been shown a future where he was irrelevant. Lucas watched the slow, humiliating retreat of the threat, his composure unbroken. He hadn't moved an inch. He had won the war without firing a shot, merely by revealing the unassailable truth of his economic position. The 5 words were not a threat of violence, but a pronouncement of market reality. "I'm leaving now," Lucas stated, his voice returning to its normal, low conversational tone, as if they had merely been discussing real estate. "You can kill me on the way out if you like, but you know what happens then." He turned his back on the mobster, the ultimate act of contemptuous victory, the demonstration that the armed man no longer posed a threat that warranted attention. He walked slowly toward the door, every step measured, every movement a calculated insult to the old ways of power. The mobster stood frozen, gun in hand, utterly paralyzed by the economic logic that superseded his code of honor and violence. The truth revealed by Lucas was more lethal than any bullet. Lucas opened the door, stepped into the hallway, and pulled the door shut behind him. The silence in the office was now truly empty, hollowed out by the revelation. The mobster had been given the chance to exercise his violence, and he had been forced to recognize that in the modern world of transnational crime, violence was secondary to leverage. He had stared down the barrel of a financial reality that was far more terrifying than death itself. The conclusion was evident in the shift of power that followed this meeting. Frank Lucas was not killed, he was tolerated. The commission was forced to deal with him, begrudgingly accepting the presence of a Black Caesar, operating on a scale, and with an independence they had never permitted before. The 5 words, "The triangle runs right through me," forced the realization that Lucas was not a rival to be eliminated, but a force of nature to be managed. His dominance grew, unchecked, for years, protected not by bodyguards, but by the devastating economic simplicity of his supply chain. He had stared down the most dangerous men in the city, not with a bigger gun, but with an irrefutable business plan. This moment in that smoky office, the moment the gun was lowered, remains the silent hinge upon which the history of 1970s organized crime turned. It was the moment that demonstrated that in the evolving landscape of power, the ability to control logistics and source material trumped bloodlines and brute intimidation. Lucas didn't just survive that day, he won the future. This wasn't merely the story of a mobster pulling a gun, but the definitive proof that true power, the kind that changes the rules of the game forever, is often found not in the willingness to take a life, but in the possession of the leverage that renders the act of murder entirely pointless. But the story of Frank Lucas, the man who smiled in the face of death and whispered his way to untouchable power, is only half complete. Understanding the full depth of that leverage, the astonishing corruption, the network of protection, and the ultimate, inevitable downfall that follows such absolute control, requires digging further into the clandestine dealings that sustained that untouchable supply chain. We've seen the climax of the confrontation, but the full scope of the empire built upon those 5 terrifying words demands a deeper examination of the men in uniform who protected the flow and the eventual, spectacular implosion of the whole endeavor. The ascent was miraculous, but the crash was legendary, and the details surrounding the military complicity that defined his rise are essential to grasping the true scale of his operation.